The topic I want to talk about today is outbound investments, but I have a cultural angle to that. And there are four things I want to cover. There are a fair number of slides in the presentation. I don't intend to go through all of them, but I will skip some of them, but they're available for you if you want to look at that. Now, the first one is slogan behind China's rise. Now, Chinese love slogans. It went all the way back to Shiji, written by Sima Qian. Everything is conceptually condensed into like a four-letter word, a phrase. And today, you see a lot of that from the government. And now let's take a look at some of them. Before I started digging into our presentation, let's look at some numbers. Now, 21st century is always talked about by everybody as the Asian century. Why is that so? Now, World Bank had the Asian Pacific region, including India and East Asia, growing about 6.4%. World growth is slightly over 5%, according to World Bank's statistics. And China's GDP growth for 2017 was upgraded to 6.7% from about 6.5% a few months ago. So there's room for China to exceed the growth. Now, another thing that's quite important that we don't talk about a lot is that 60% of the world's population, or 7.2 billion, live in Asia. India is 1.3 billion. The former India subcontinent, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, if you count Nepal and Bhutan, that's almost like another 2 billion population, huge. And what is considered traditional Chinese sphere influence? China was encountered foreigners primarily from the mid-18th century or so when British went to China, wanted to have an access to the market. And India also met with the British Raj in 1715 or so in Calcutta as the East Indian Company. So at that time, China's GDP, someone estimated at 1750, was about 25% of the world's GDP. India was about 23% in those days. After the Second World War, where China, eliminated all the concession areas that are owned by foreigners from the Potsdam Agreement, and India went independent in 1947. China's GDP after 1945 was only 5% of the world's GDP. India is about 3%. So all these years of exploitation by the colonial powers and really dropped the two largest nations in Asia GDP to minimum standards. Okay. Now, the traditional Chinese theory influence, including China proper, the mainland, and the territory of Taiwan and Hong Kong, and Korea and so on. Now, Korea was part of the vassal state of China until the 1890s, when China lost the war to Japan, had to see Korea, had allowed Korea to be independent. And they signed the Shimonoseki Agreement with Japan. And Vietnam was also vassal state of China until 1850, when France entered the Second Opium War and beat China to that. So this sphere, all these territories in Asia were at one time influenced by China greatly in laws, in culture, legal matters. Now, I can broadly say about 30% of the world population, almost 2 billion, are influenced by a common Chinese culture. So I'm going to tell you later what I think that is. And what we consider Westerner today, we kind of spearhead everything that we do today. The culture, we can say that generally attributed to the Greeks. What are these cultures? The idea of individual, the idea of democracy, of freedom, the ideas of law, the ideas of logic, which is promulgated by Aristotle. It kind of permeate today, even today, we use rational analysis. What's that based on? Logic. And what we do today in the Western part of the world has a lot to do with the Greeks earlier on. Now, what I want to do today is impress upon you in another 40 minutes or so that there is another way to look at things, another worldview That is what they call Chinese worldview. I'm not talking about communist worldview, but Chinese, broadly, Chinese worldview. And the Western worldview is very analytical, very precise. The Chinese worldview is a bit more hazy, but in fact, it's valid. I want to tell you that from this presentation, it's valid. Now, it's valid and also very powerful in Asia. But if you apply that to management businesses overseas, then you run into some troubles. I'll tell you what they are. Now, if you look at I chose a 20-year period from 1997, which is the onset of Asia financial crisis, when Thailand devalued Thai baht against the US dollar, so it was free floating. So along with that exercise, Indonesian devalued the rupiah, Korean devalued the won, so there was competitive devaluation. And the hedge funds and George Soros and the like had a field day because they keep short selling the currencies, and they kept going lower and lower and lower. As a result, some of these countries went bankrupt and had to be rescued by IMF. Now, I was there in 1997 in Hong Kong. I experienced all that. Every day there's a headline, the stock market director, and 10%, 5%. Okay, it was like, hell, if you're trying to be a banker, you can't really do any deals in that kind of environment. But if you look at this chart here, it's very instructive. In the 20-year period time, China's GDP went from 967 billion US dollars to about 12 trillion today, last year, 11.8 trillion. 13 times increment. Vietnam also went up quite a bit. Now, if you look at this at the bottom of the list, I'm not talking about US, but Taiwan and Hong Kong and Japan. These were very Confucian societies that went democratic. They took in the Western values and decided to have democracy. As a result, in Hong Kong, nothing gets done the last 20 years. People fight. Nothing gets done. Economy is only 1.8 times. Look, I'm not going to say who is right or wrong, but you look at this number, which society would you rather live in? That's the question. Do you want to talk freely or do you want to live comfortably? To understand China, you got to understand the slogans behind it. In 1979, the then paramount leader of China called Deng Xiaoping, he came out with this thing called socialism with Chinese characteristics. This is an incredible phrase, try to apprehend, because it's kind of like an oxymoron, because socialism on one hand is a very Western idea. Then you have a Chinese characteristics. What are these Chinese characteristics? He didn't make it clear. That's Chinese way of doing things, very, very murky. You interpret it yourself. But what it is that socialism, which is a intermediate step to communism, supposedly, is a very binary Western concept. One class overthrows the other, and they take it all. Winners take all. That's what socialism is. But in Chinese, don't do things that way. Chinese want to have a balance. You don't have a winner that takes everything. If you have two sides of contest, one side win, one side lose, one side win, one side lose, or both sides loses, the fourth outcome is both sides wins. That's a Chinese way, a preferred way of doing things, is that we can work together to solve problems. And that's, to my mind, is what drove the Chinese economy up so much, along with the opening up the market and also WTO entry in 2001. Is that they don't fight each other anymore, they work together. Now, about 4 years ago, the current leader, Xi Jinping, also talked about the Chinese dream. What is this Chinese dream? Chinese dream is just a revitalize of the Chinese culture, find out what is good about the Chinese culture and strengthen it, and use that to govern. The next one I'll talk about culture as origin a little bit. And if you have not seen this book called The Geography of Thought, written by Professor Richard Nisbett of Michigan, he's a distinguished professor of social psychology. Now, he studied how people of different ethnic races behave. And he did experiments using psychological experiments on a computer by a computer. He had a group of Westerners, primarily white Americans, and then a group of Asians. The Asians are either Korean, Japanese, or Chinese. They either were first immigrants or they were born here for a long period of time or raised second, third generation. They asked questions, and they scrambled them together first. So he doesn't know who answers what. But then he found also a pattern emerges from these studies, that the Asian generally behave a certain way, that the Westerners behave another way. Then he started drawing some inferences. He said, look, Asians do it that way because of their cultural heritage or Confucianism. They think about a group first rather than themselves first, and the Westerners generally think about themselves as individuals. And so they answer things with that kind of viewpoint. And this is a very insightful book to read, because the first time I see quantitatively, you can distinguish the two cultures and behavior based on two cultures. And I love that. And I communicate with Professor Nisbett. He became a reviewer of my book, and then he wrote something nice about it. Now, I'm going to be very, very general here, and to the point that maybe I'm gloss over a lot of things, and people will criticize me for being simplistic. But I think that's valid. Our current way of life in the West is primarily due to the Greeks. Your Socratic analysis, Plato, talk about the form, the idea, various ideas, and you had Aristotle. Aristotle was a brilliant man. He knew everything: astronomy, physics, mathematics, physiology, medicine, everything. But I think one of the most important contributions he did to our society and culture is ethics and the logic that he prescribed. I think that, continue to this day, influence our way of life. But because of logic, okay. Oh, gee, sorry. Because the logic we're so embedded in this logic. We believe that if something is logical, then it's got to be true. The Greek anthropologist Edward Hall once said, Westerners believe their own snake oil, that because they believe in logic, therefore whatever they deduce to be logical, consistent, it's got to be true. If it's true, then it's got to be factual. It seems to be turning things around. And logic is important, but it doesn't apply to everything. It applies to simplistic matters, A plus B equals A equals B equals C, therefore A equals C type of thing. But how do you describe what A is? How do you describe what C is? Well, A and C are complex persons or behaviors or something that cannot be distilled down into simple character. And this is the problem we have with our logical deduction sometimes. We come to conclusions. For example, Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. Saddam Hussein has used chemical weapons. Therefore, Saddam Hussein's got to have weapons of mass destruction. That's a very logical deduction if you believe in all the steps and assumptions. But therefore, we've got to eliminate him. But that's kind of pitfall of this kind of analysis. We have to uphold market practice, discipline. Therefore, Lehman Brothers, didn't adhere to market practice. Therefore, it should be punished. Now, market discipline was like an academic word devised by some, economist. It's not really how the only way things work. Now, because of this view, we tend to think there are context-independent solutions to everything, like Newton. Newton, in the late 17th century, deduced the law of mechanics, how the heavenly body moves based on some simple formula. So an apple that drops from an orchard in Cambridge is likely to drop from a different orchard in Beijing, because the law of gravity works on both sides. Okay. But can you use some laws to describe our social behavior? I don't think so. I think it's very tough. But we think that there are some laws, and this is why the Western ways can be very narrow, and it's very adversarial. In China, I think the earliest book that people could remember was probably I Ching. I Ching was probably, people found that in fragments of Shan, the Zhou dynasty bronze vessels, and the thing is about at least 3,000 years old. Now, I Ching is just basically how the ancient people look at the world. They had to look at how the nature works, and they said, well, we have to live according to nature's rules. So we form a set of rules that kind of follow nature's rules. Okay, that's how I Ching works. And along with that, we have Confucianism and Lao Tzu. Now, in the Chinese way of thinking, they don't have logic, so it's not very clear a lot of times. But there's a way to get to a solution. If you let things massage a little bit, you come out to some solution. It's not a clear solution, not distinctive solution. And we rely a lot on what is called moral ethics to govern. If I can summarize the difference between the Western way of thinking and the Chinese or the Eastern way of thinking, it would be very general about it. It's probably this chart here. On the left, you see the familiar yin-yang symbol. Now, the interesting thing about it is within the yin, there's a portion of yang inside. Within the yang, there's a portion of yin inside. And that's how the Chinese prefer to do things. Everything has two sides. Nothing is distinct. And the right side, you see a circle with two halves, black and white. Now, that's the Western way of doing things. Okay, things can either be black or white. The Brexit, for example, that happened a couple of years ago, the vote was 51 point some percent to 48 point some percent. So you would think that the ones that got 51% would win, and that's the rules. But what about the other 48%? How are they served by this? And you see what's going on now. There's still lots of negotiation between the UK government and the EU about things. Maybe they have second thoughts. So this kind of context, kind of resolution where everything is reduced to a contest and winner or loser may not work for a lot of situations, in my mind. The Chinese way is this. You have the yin and the yang, they work together. They don't overcome each other, because if you try to overtake each other, then you expose your weak side, and that side will get bigger. Let's say if I want to kick Dr. Leung here, okay? If I do them a very strong kick, what do I do? Expose my groin for his counterattack. My yang becomes an yin liability. So you want to do that. You want to have balance, and that's the one Chinese do, balance. Now, the offshoots of I Ching, scholars said there are Confucianism and Taoism. The most important pillar of Confucianism is actually benevolence, Zen. Now, this is Confucius' idea. He thinks this is a human nature, that I should feel how you feel. Therefore, I won't hurt you because I do things that I don't like to myself, to you, because this way I will hurt you. Okay? If I don't want my country to be invaded, then I'm not going to invade another country. If I don't want someone to come into my household, tell me how to run my household or teach my kids, I'm not going to go into the household and tell you how you teach your kids. But this is exactly how the Chinese government operates foreign policy. If you listen to Xi Jinping's talk and this opening talk in the 19th Party Congress, he mentioned these things. It's not communistic. It's very much Confucian. Now, the Chinese has a little bit of digression, has a great way of combining stuff that Western and massaging their own culture becomes very Chinese. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is obviously an apple, a red apple, big red. On the surface, stenciled Merry Christmas. Well, why would a apple be Merry Christmas? Well, it turned out in the 80s, a young guy, at that time China was still very poor. In the 80s, he wanted to give his girlfriend a gift during Christmas. Christmas was beginning to be a commercial activity in China, nothing religious about it, just an opportunity to get together to have a big meal with family and friends. So he said, why don't I give her some apples? So he concocted this idea, because Christmas Eve is the eve of Jesus' arrival. And Jesus is the bearer of peace. And therefore, Christmas Eve in Chinese Mandarin is called 平安夜, 平安夜, peaceful evening. Now, it just so happened in Mandarin, apple is called 苹果. So there are two rhymes, two words of rhyme. So he said, okay, 苹果 should, if I give you 苹果on Christmas Eve, then you should usher you in for auspicious season. Auspicious well-wishing is a very Chinese thing. Okay, it has nothing to do with religion. Okay, so now it becomes a kind of a tradition in China. The Chinese has ways of taking things Western and kind of massage it, and it becomes very Chinese. And this is one of the examples. This is a pizza. I don't know if you've seen this. So there's pizza with peanuts on it. So does anybody know what it is? On the right-hand side, it's called a Kung Pao chicken pizza. The Kung Pao chicken, you have it in restaurants all the time. It's very popular now in China because Chinese like the spicy food. And they just, okay, why don't I put this on as a topping? And then on the left-hand side is the Peking duck pizza. So you have pizza that kind of become very Chinese. And Chinese has a ways of taking Western things, and through its teachings of Confucianism, tolerance, all that, and make it into Chinese. I'm not going to go through a lot of these things because of interest of time. So let me go to the management style. Because the Chinese way of thinking is not often logical. It's very, interactional. So therefore, a lot of the decisions are slow and deliberate. You might have heard the expression of feeling rocks while crossing a river. 摸着石头过河, and that is that if you want to cross a river, you don't know how deep it is and how fast the water is. You take little steps. Okay, if you can feel the rocks, you know it's steady. Then you take a step there, and and you feel around. If you see another solid ground, you take another step. That's how the Chinese does things. Okay, it's deliberate and piecemeal, and until you get to the other side. And then also, the Chinese like this consensus decision making. This is probably a contribution of the communist regime, but lots of consultations to drive consensus. When I was working with China, on several occasions, I was involved in some of these study groups, where because I had worked in Moody's, I had looked at the banking system from a rating agency's point of view, and I was invited to some of these discussions, and it was very open. I went to one, for example, in Hong Kong, in Bank of China building, about 20 people in the room, talk about RMB liberalization. I thought I knew something about the subject, and when I went there, I realized that everybody's an expert in that. They studied this thing from the inside out, thoroughly, and all the different elements, the pros and cons, what can be done, what cannot be done, what are the consequences. And they're finished up, they report this to PBOC. And there's dozens of other study groups like that. They consolidate every idea, and they try to reach consensus. So when we see the result from China, and some policy being announced, it's actually the result of a very deliberate process. We don't see it because it's not public. But then again, it's not open. We don't go on the floors of the Congress and fight each other for these things. They're talking behind closed door. So consensus decision making. But because of the Confucian hierarchy, sometimes the boss is the consensus. Everybody's trying to figure out what the boss is thinking, because he can be very important in the process. So as a result, it becomes like, for people who are not that strong in what they do, becomes a game of guessing what the boss does. And that's not very desirable. Now, I mentioned earlier in 1997, Asia had a financial crisis and therefore devaluation of currency. Now, China was under a lot of pressure to devalue its own currency because RMB was pegged to US dollar, 8.27 RMB to a US dollar for many, many years. And China at that time, the foreign currency reserve was $150 billion when we were trying to pitch for sovereign bond deals and so on and so forth. 150. Today it's over 3 trillion, 20 times. Now, China really had to work hard not to devalue because exports went down a lot because of the crisis. The neighboring country, Malaysia and Thailand, they all export a lot more because their currency has been devalued. They're more appealing to buyers. But China did not. And I was wondering, why didn't they do that? They told me, look, we don't want to create more problems for our neighbors in Asia. What happened was they looked at the currency crisis in Asia as something instigated by speculators, like George Soros and his funds, Tiger funds and other funds, that short-selling the currencies for the purpose of making profits. But they think this is very unseemly because, wait a minute, you can make a profit, but why do you drive the government's in a bankruptcy. Because along with that, there's a lot of social issues. Indonesia had huge riots, and the government of Suharto was deposed. Thousands of people died in these riots. And, have you not thought about these consequences? They don't want that to happen to China. And because that was 1997. And then we have 2001, 2002, U.S. invasion of Iraq. And that kind of brought the whole Middle East up topsy-turvy. So why is that we try to solve one single problem that affects everything else? And why didn't they think about this? And in 2008, my former employer, Lehman Brothers, went bankrupt. That, again, was something totally preventable from the officials' point of view. Why didn't they help Lehman? They didn't. The whole world went to pots because of that. So they say, look, we cannot follow the American lead anymore because what they're leading us is the path of destruction. Because their way of thinking is that you got to have black and white winners and losers. So you can see gradually from that point on, there were the ideas on the ideological front. We got to contest with our own ideology, our own culture, and on the business side, you have to have own champions. A lot of American companies complain that, oh, wait, Chinese are closing the market on us. I can tell you from personal experience, I was working in China in year 2000 as CFO of a tech company. We bought Cisco products. Now, Cisco was such a hot company at that time. We're a small company, so if we decide to buy something, we got to pay cash before they even ship us products. And it would take them 3 months to ship us anything. So if they hold our cash, we have basically an IOU of products. So that's how Cisco and IBM were so profitable in those years, but there's nothing to replace them. And today, it's a bit more competitive. A Chinese company come up, Huawei's and ZTE and all that. But the most important point of this cultural awakening is actually the Chinese identity side. There is a strong Chinese identity, and they're looking for that. If you see the popular TVs and movies and talk about China and the traditional China, not the modern day China, the village life and things like that, they want to promote that. Now, in my book, I talk about 3 activities, Tai Chi versus boxing. Boxing is a very Western thing. It started with the Greeks. Okay, you have a boxing match, you knock the other guy down, then you're the winner if you stand up. And Tai Chi is not. You see these guys working slowly and backwards. They look like they're dancing. They're not really fighting each other. Okay, but if you're aggressive, you lose your balance, you get thrown off. The worst you can do is thrown on the ground. You're not going to get killed. And that's the Chinese way of doing things. On war, now, Sun Tzu is well-known Chinese military strategist, lived about 2,600 years ago. And then you have Karl von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz was late 18th century Prussia, now Germany, military strategist. And these two were the dominant thinkers in military academies. And Clausewitz's book is about 700 pages, pretty thick one. Sun Tzu is like tiny 100-page book. So in these two, you can see the difference in national characteristics. Sun Tzu prefers to evade rather than fight head on. Unless I have 2 or 3 times your power, I'm not going to fight you head on. Okay? I'm going to evade. I'm going to let you dissipate. It's like Tai Chi, move away, dissipate you. And then I'm going to find your weaknesses and then come and give you a hard time. Now, Sun Tzu prefers to win without fighting. Well, how can you win without fighting? Well, you have an army, you have people. People make decisions. You have arms, you have rockets and tanks. These things, they don't go by themselves. Someone has to direct them. Sun Tzu's idea is that if you can weaken your enemy's resolve to fight, okay, if you can somehow influence them psychologically through deception, psychological warfare, whatnot, okay, fake news, whatnot, then you can weaken them. You can weaken them, therefore, you can achieve your objective without fighting. That's a desired way. So in Clausewitz's book, he talked about a concept of center of mass. A center of mass is a Newtonian concept. For a solid object, okay, like this one here, there's a point here, that you can pinpoint to where you can spin it easily. That is called a center of mass. He said that when you have an army, an enemy army, you want to locate a center of mass. What you want, where the troops are most concentrated, the command center is. You want to seek it out and have a decisive battle. This is what happened in the Vietnam War. We kept fighting and looking for the North NVA, North Vietnamese regulars, and try to bring to the battle. We could never find them because they disappear, because they operate like water. When you hit the bucket of water, the water splashes, they go away. And when you remove your hand, the water reconstitutes. That's the Sun Tzu's idea of warfare. Look, I'm not going to fight with you, but I'm going to come back and give you a hard time when you are not least expected. Now, when these concepts distill into management behavior, you have two different sets. A Westerner, you have a manager who deals with things analytically, and he is the professional manager. He manages resources, be it the number of people you have, the equipment you have, the money that's given to you, and you have a certain budget, and also you have a certain target that you need to accomplish. You are responsible for it, okay? If you do well, you may get a bonus. If you don't, then you could get demoted or fired, whatever. The process is very important in the Western management circles. In Chinese, it's somewhat different. Chinese use the word 领导, 领导 to denote their superior. What is this guy? This guy is a very respectable person in the organization. He steps inside of you. He knows everything. You respect him, okay? So, you know, like a boss in a Chinese organization, very high up, he knows everything about you. Supposed to know everything about you. He doesn't always do, but he pretends to. So, it's the result that counts, okay? Because in Chinese world, it's not clear black and white. It's holistic, okay? There are many ways to get things done. So, it's the result that counts. You know, Deng Xiaoping said famously, you know, it doesn't matter whether the cat's black or white as long as it catches mice. Now, that's a very brilliant way of applying this. You know, cat is no longer an emotional animal, a pet you can have that can keep you company. Cat is now just a mice catching machine. But what that means is that you can get the results you want through many different means. Now, this is a small portion of the table that I accepted from my book. For Western manager, and I'm very general about this, it may not be totally correct, but just put it here for comparison. I'd like to look for why. Why did this happen? How can we solve the problem? The Chinese manager, less about why. He said, look, how can we make it work? How can we make it work? Find solutions. And the Westerners tend to look for differences. Did you or not did you do this? Yes or no type of answers. And the Chinese generally look for a common ground, okay? How can we work together? What are your concerns? How can we work together? Not what our differences are. What are our common ground is? And you know, in China, generally like talk about the majority, because the majority occupies the common ground or the middle way, and that's what the Chinese like to focus on. If you look at this diagram here that I created in the book, there's outer layer and there's inside. The inside is where the fundamental of a business is, and fundamental that a manager has some control of in the business. You know, the product design, the marketing campaign, the finance, the legal, the risk management, all that stuff. This is something that he has some control. Outside of this fundamental circle are the things that he has no control. These are the politics, what's happening in Washington, what's happening in Beijing, the market needs, and the support you might get from others to make your business work. And this outside circle is of relative importance in different cultures. In China, that's more important than the fundamentals, because in China, the rules are changing all the time. An interpretation of that are not always the same. So you got to make sure that local official in charge of approval of your project is on the same page as you. So you got to spend a lot of time dining and bringing gifts and make sure you understand their concerns, make sure where they're going, make sure they understand your concerns, maybe able to give you a tip or two So you know that how to position your company for something that's coming down. So managers in China spend lots of time doing this kind of work, whereas managers in America most spend time doing their own thing, because what's outside is relatively flat. Everybody's on a relatively fair playground. So you and I are the same company. We don't have any more favors from our regulators. We don't have more than 4 favors from the capital markets. So it's for us to get what we want. Now I come back to the main topic here, outbound investments. Now I just mentioned earlier that the Chinese way of thinking is a different way of thinking than the one that we are traditionally accomplished to, that we learn in schools and practice and so on. This way of thinking is a bit murky, is a bit interactional, and it's not very clear. It's not logical. But it works in the Chinese context, in Asia and China. You look at the economy grew very fast. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with this. And the question you want to raise now is that if you bring that strategy overseas to investment in developed markets, would that work? Now, in 2000, Jiang Zemin proclaimed going out. Now, about a year or two before that, I was in Beijing. I was a coverage officer for China Development Bank for Lehman Brothers. So I was there with my colleague Ted Roosevelt from New York. Ted Roosevelt's grandfather was the president. So he has a name card that's very powerful, it opened doors. So we were there waiting for the senior banker from CDB to come and talk to us. He was late for about half an hour. So we're there drinking beer, eating fried scorpions, whatever, that kind of stuff. So then he came in with his entourage. He got very excited. Let me tell you what I learned today at State Council. We're going to have initiatives. We're going to find ways to move the gas from Western China to Eastern China, 西去东输. We're going to move the water from the South China, where it's flooding all the time, to the north, where it's arid most of the time, 南水北调. And then he said, look, we are going to open up the Great Northwest, develop Great Northwest. At that time, referring to Tibet, Xinjiang, and Qinghai, that sort of area, kind of poor. And then the last one said, we're going to 走出去, we're going to go out the country. Now, if you go back 15, 20 years, year 2000, China was a very tough shape. Its foreign currency reserve, 150 billion, or a little bit more, slightly more. It had the terrible problem with the state-owned enterprise reform. All kinds of bad debt, all kinds of unemployment, 30, 40 unemployed people walking around that looks like they're lost. So when you have that condition, how could you go outside? What do you have? Do you have money? Do you have people? Do you have resources? But communist leaders are really great at coming with very schematical long-term thinking. So that, 2005 was further affirmed in 2011. NDRC is the National Development and Research Restructuring Commission, the very top think tank, a government think tank. So now, with the government, pacing the pace for companies to go out, and this is what's happening in China. The government says something, they say, oh yeah, right, we're going to support the government, we're going to go out. And the government didn't say that company X, you have to go out. They said, I'm going to go out because I'm following the government. And with that, you can get better bank loans, you get better projects. You can just say, when you see your counterparts in other countries, you say, okay, we have government support. In fact, you have no support. But that's how Chinese work in terms of proposing something that they don't have. Now, this is a chart I borrowed from a research study by the Rhodium Group here in LA, very good research house on China and Asia. In about 2013 or so, 2010 to 2012-13, China's outbound investment started to go up. At the beginning, it's mostly on raw material resource intense type of areas, and which denoted by this blue line. And then it started going up generally, and then later on, a couple of years ago, it became more interested in, consumer areas, electronics, things like that. Until late 2016, it started taking a drop. And earlier this year, it dropped substantially. Now, at the beginning, I don't know, this chart is very conclusive to that argument, is that the red lines represent state-owned companies. And then you have Outbound, which is an insurance company, which bought out, I think, the famous hotel in New York. I forgot what the name is. Oh, yeah, Waldorf, yeah. It converted into condominiums. Yeah. And now, and then it started buying up everything, entertainment companies, and finally government said, look, stop, okay, stop. Now, none of these companies, in my mind, has any government real support, except maybe CIC, which is China Investment Corp. That's a sovereign fund, China sovereign, about 700-800 billion in assets in Beijing. HNA is the parent of Hainan Airline, and they're very big everywhere. Now, why would the Chinese government stop all that? And why would they not want companies to go outside? So that's a question people are puzzling. Now, I'm going to give you an example. I don't want to accuse anybody. In about 15 years ago, 2002, I was in Beijing. I participated in a financial conference where I gave a talk. And when I stepped out of the podium, back on the floor, and I was approached by a young man. He said, Dr. Yen, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah, sure. What is it? I thought he was going to ask me about bank regulations. But it's not true. He said, look, I come from Chongqing. I come from a state-owned enterprise. We have a project in Algeria. The manager of the project, last week, withdrew all the money from our company account and put it in his personal account. And then it disappeared. What can we do? I said, look, I don't know how to help you with that one. Okay, do you know his family? Usually Chinese are very conservative family. Are they still here? And a lot of times the family's already gone. So this is one of the problems with Chinese overseas investments. In China, they watch very carefully, but when they go overseas, oftentimes there are leakages everywhere. And you don't know where they're going to the projects they said they were going, but it could be just gone for personal reasons. I'm using here numbers, the Chinese convention. The red means up, green means down, just the other way. In 2011, we had about 60 billion of ODI, and it went up to about 170 billion in 2016, up double digits every year. In 2017, it started going down substantially first half of the year. First 1 month, it went up a little bit, but still substantially down from last year. If you read the headlines, they were disaster. ODI up, ODI down, ice age, plungers, curb, strength and oversight, brakes, all these very action words describing the state of Chinese ODI. Chinese ODI. And now, if you read headlines a lot, this gives you a lot of, scare. You wonder what's happening. How come nobody foresee this? How come nobody saw this happening? Why are they still running outside and all of a sudden someone cut off and they say, oh, wait a minute, the project cannot go on. What about your counterparty? What about the deals that you're negotiating? Are they going to go on? How can you continue? So these are the issues that managers think about. But when you have this directive from the government, all banks shut off the financing, so you cannot do the deals anymore. Now, factors affecting China's ODI, there are many factors. Now, you can read that in the website later on. But I think the most important one, in my opinion, is actually language and cultural barriers. In addition to the motives of outside ODI. Now, I'm going to go into a few case studies to illustrate the point. The first one I'll talk about is TCL. TCL, as you know, if you go to Hollywood, now adorns the what used to be the Chinese theater, Grauman's Chinese theater. Now it's TCL. Okay, TCL actually first letter of the last name of the three founders from Huizhou in Guangdong province. The last one is Li, and it's actually Thompson Li is still the chairman of TCL. Now, after the pronouncement of going out policy, TCL went on a bunch of acquisitions. 2002 acquired Schneider, 2004 acquired Alcatel, 2003 they did the biggest deal, acquired Thompson. Thompson is a TV maker in France, and Thompson, owned brands such as RCA, Magnavox, and so on. But RCA is a very, legendary brand because it's founded by Thomas Edison. If you remember the phonograph records, the LPs, and you see this dog barking into a speaker, that's RCA. That's the original entertainment equipment maker. And Thompson was the owner of it. But in 2000 or so, they ran into trouble because of cost issues. The French cost is very high, production is very high, and they were challenged by Koreans and Japanese. So they thought, the bankers put these deals together, and they thought that we could use TCL's low-cost manufacturing base and then direct those products in Europe, have Thompson distributed in Europe and North America. We have the marriage made in heaven. In fact, Thompson Lee has said that the strategic alliance fulfills our objective of being one of the top players in multimedia electronic devices in the global marketplace. What a concise statement. But as someone in the financial industry, when I read something like that from a Chinese guy, I know someone else put it up together for them. This is done by Morgan Stanley. Okay, they put the deals together and they put this press release for him to announce. But what happened is, everything looked good on paper, it didn't work. In 2006, barely 2 years after the joint venture was announced, they had to close it down and write off the losses. Now, when you had to follow the government blindly and went into things because your banker told you so, and you look at the risks involved, you could have a lot of problems. The culture is being a lot of it is hidden, it's qualitative. Now, in most companies you work, the manufacturing guys are at the bottom. They receive orders from marketing departments and what to make, what product to make, and R&D and all that stuff. And so they listen to orders. Okay, here you guys, some guy from the counties of Guangdong telling some guy sitting in Paris how to run their company. There's a lot of natural resistance to that kind of order flow. So that's a problem. And the French has a huge cost issue. Their labor force is one of the most inflexible ones in Europe. You can't really fire people that easily. You have all kinds of documentation, all that stuff. And they only work 35-hour weeks. And they have a huge 4 months of vacation every summer. And to the Chinese, this is unacceptable. The Chinese generally work 24 hours a day. In today's world, if you work in China in your office, you work from 9 to 9. That's common practice, and 6 days a week. In those days, if you were a CEO, you work 12, 14 hours a day. You're on the phone all the time, directing this and directing that. And they couldn't figure out why the colleagues in Paris, shut off their phone when they went home. So different work culture. And there is a professionalism versus hierarchy. In Thompson, how you get promoted is how well you're doing your job. Okay? Not how well you know somebody, which is mostly the case in China. You know somebody, have good guanxi, you get promoted. And then if you're close to the CEO, then you have more power. But in Thompson's case, different. It's how well you contribute to the job. So although you are just a scientist or somebody, but you're pretty highly esteemed in a corporation like that. But in China, you're not close to the chairman, you're nobody. And so that's another problem. There are a lot of communications issues. No, we at Lehman, we work with TCL on some other deal. They disclosed to me and they were laughing. So at the beginning, both sides were very gung-ho about this. So we had many, many conference calls. We spoke English. The Chinese side spoke English, the French side spoke English. Now, I don't know which one's easier to understand, but in a conference call, Nobody understood each other. So finally, Thompson Lee said, look, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just speak Mandarin. And that really created a problem for the French side. Look, so they had to get it translated, the nuances and this and that. They couldn't get things done. And this is a huge amount of problem. I think that caused all the synergy expectations kind of evaporated because of the cultural reasons. Now we have, I'm not going through this for sake of time, but I'll go through the last one. Haier is a very well-known example of Chinese success. Now let's take a look at why it's successful. Now Haier is just one of the many defunct refrigerator makers in China, in Shandong, in the early 80s. And they found, later on, they found a JV with the German manufacturer Liher. And they now, they basically that change. One of the co-founders of Haier, his name is Zhang Mian. And then she said, look, when I first assigned to this factory in Qingdao, there were 700 people on payroll. I didn't find nobody working there. SOE is like that. You're on the payroll, you don't have to go to work. And then all the windows are broken. And in fact, the factory is just as cold as the refrigerator making. So that's the situation these managers got. And they somehow turned it around. And that's incredible. And in the 1990s, they went outside China. They first went to Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. These are the countries that smaller, rules are not as rigid, and they could deal with that. So they built factories in those countries and serve locally. And then in 1999, they decided to enter U.S. through South Carolina. And next year afterwards, they built a big plant in South Carolina. 2002, they bought Sanyo. Sanyo's electric appliances, Japan and Asia. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Sanyo, as a child growing up in Hong Kong in the 60s, Sanyo is the original producer of the rice cooker. Sanyo rice cooker was the thing to have in the kitchen. And now they also make TVs and all that stuff. And last year, they acquired GE Appliance. At that time, the second largest appliance maker in America. The first one is Whirlpool. Now, how did they get there? How were they successful? One of the things about Haier is it's a very flexible company. They have all kinds of rules, but they're willing to bend their rules according to local conditions. And the chairman, Zhang Weiming, is very good at that. And in some interviews, he gave credit to Chinese philosophy. And Yi Ching, as Patrick said, look, the heaven moves, bodies move around all the time. Therefore, we should emulate that we should not stop. We should always continue moving and improving ourselves. So that's great. That's how he looks at his company himself. The other war, you know you know your enemy and know yourself. Okay, find out what the weakness is and go penetrate it. And treat everyone like every encounter like a battle, but you got to know your enemy well. You have to do the study. From the Daxue, the book of great learning, and it's a self-improvement. Traditional culture starts from the center of the person. Okay, you got to discipline yourself, you got to improve before you can influence others. Now, he had that in mind. And the last thing is actually quite important from Dao De Jing, from Lao Tzu. You cannot change the operations of a business that often. You cannot say one thing today and change it to another thing tomorrow, like we see on TV all the time. That's not how you do things. Because Lao Tzu said, managing a country is like frying a small fish. If you turn it too often, you break everything. The fish becomes bone and a mess. You can't do that. You have to manage according to the right time. The right time is Tao. And in Zhang Ruiming's ideas, Haier is actually quite an innovative company. They come out with new products all the time. So his idea is, look, why don't we put ourselves down rather than the Confucian hierarchy, put ourselves up? I'm going to put myself down because when I'm down, then I'm in a position to receive others. My employees will have ideas. They will flow down to me. I will gather them. I will make something out of it. And the company benefits, whole company benefits. That's how he ran this company. So, conclusions. What works in China does not work overseas automatically. You have to manage, you have to take the good things about your culture and apply it practically locally. Cultural business practice are significant barriers to overcome. And to learn from practical lessons is important. Now you tell this to Chinese CEOs, they don't believe you. They say, oh, so-and-so did that because they didn't do this. I'm better than him, so I'm going to do the same thing. They're going to repeat the same problem over and over again. Whereas today, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it's the same thing. Chinese generally have a pretty bloated idea about their abilities. And this can lead to a problem. Well, at this point, I'd like to thank you for being here. This concludes my presentation.